While perusing today on ye old internet, I saw a headline that instantly reminded me of a line from the Pledge of Allegiance. I know it sounds really weird, but indoctrination being what it is, if you make a small child repeat something enough times, uh, 30 years later, it still pops into their head because we're conditioned. But I digress. Um, with liberty and justice for all. Liberty and justice for all. Um, it's an important point and very often the flashpoint for social movements. America as a government, as a founding organization, uh, likes to flippantly throw around the word all. Uh, I seem to recall uh, we said all men are created equal, and we put that down on a piece of paper in a time when it literally only applied to white men who owned other human beings. That was all men. That was it. All men were actually not created equal, and we don't have liberty and justice for all. Even if you get past the social movement stuff, we've gotten to the point now because we're so polarized as a nation, and of course, most problems are top-down problems, that what's going on in the current government is only exacerbating the polarization that we currently have. So here's the headline I caught. Trump moves to cut federal funding from Democratic cities. Liberty and justice for all. Except for all those people who live in cities that vote Democrats. Then, fuck y'all. Yeah. Woohoo! President directed officials to identify, quote, anarchist jurisdictions and moved to withhold funds as he tries to build his campaign around the unrest that has accompanied racial justice protests. President Trump has directed federal officials to find ways to cut funding to a string of cities controlled by Democrats, citing violence amid protests against systemic racism in policing, a move that threatens billions of dollars for many of the country's largest urban hubs as the president makes the unrest a centerpiece of his re-election campaign. This is your reminder that in the 2016 election, he essentially ran as the law and order president. He was going to lock her up, because justice. He was going to build the wall because human beings are apparently illegal, the law and order president. And then he spent the last 4 years dicking around doing a whole bunch of weird racist stuff and cratering the economy and generally not knowing what the hell he was doing. But he's back in marketing himself as a human being mode with only 60 days before the election. And this right here, this is his jam. He knows how to talk about law and order. He did it once before, seemed to have worked well for him. So they're going to go back to the well. Mr. Trump laid out the directive in a memo released Wednesday to Russell T. Voigt, the director of the Office of Management and Budget, and Attorney General William P. Barr. It accuses state and local officials of abdicating their duties. Now, this is where I point out that, yes, I am actually reading the New York Times, something I almost never do. You can go back and look through, a year of archives at this point. I don't think I've ever busted out the New York Times. They just happened to be the first one to do a deep dive on this after the Post broke a story the day before. And so for people who are immediately going to start screaming fake news, this is what the memorandum on reviewing funding to state and local government recipients that are permitting anarchy, violence, and destruction in American cities. Law and Justice, shared by the White House. Dun, 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 dun. Yeah. It's a bloviating doc. That's how you know Donald J. Trump on the bottom. You know it's legit. All right, so let us continue. Anarchy has recently beset some of our states and cities, Mr. Trump wrote in the memo, mentioning a few cities specifically: Portland, Oregon, Seattle, Washington, and his former hometown of New York City. My administration will not allow federal tax dollars to fund cities that allow themselves to deteriorate into lawless zones. This is one of the many things that Donald Trump is famous for, is when he is in a position of authority, whether it is his Trump organization or his Trump casino or his Trump golf course or his Trump steaks or his Trump airline or his Trump university or Trump water or his Trump charity or whatever the fuck it is. It always reaches a point where Donald Trump has a bunch of vassals and lackeys, and that's just how he views everybody, including governors of states and mayors of cities. And if they don't properly kiss his ring, and if they don't properly, pay him deference and, a massive amount of respect, Donald Trump will punish you for being insolent. This is what Donald Trump does. This is why he's going to go after specific cities that are run by Democrats more often than not in a state where the governor is a Democrat. Just, making the divide wider. That's what Donald Trump does. With polls showing him trailing Democratic rival Joe Biden, Trump's tried to shift the public's attention away from his administration's failed response to the coronavirus pandemic and to what he depicts as, quote, out-of-control crime in New York and other cities. He has seized on an uptick in crime and has tried to blame it on local Democratic leaders. The president has repeatedly sought to paint cities as hellscapes that only he can save, regardless of how limited the violent outbreaks have been during broader protests against active brutality of police against black people. The president has repeatedly sought to paint cities as hellscapes that only he can save. Yet, these cities were all less of a hellscape before he became president. This literally happened on his watch. I saw Donald Trump was walking around in Kenosha with, burned out buildings behind him. And unironically, some Trump group, it was like Students for Trump or Latinos for Trump or somebody, literally had a picture of Donald Trump walking through the city. And the text said, Donald Trump touring a preview of what Joe Biden's America will look like. Oh, it's so confusing. It's like mental gymnastics. I don't get how people will tie themselves in a pretzel to come up with these bizarre theories, but that's what you're dealing with. All you people who are like, you just have to speak rationally to those undecided voters and, the people who are a little bit to the right, just speak rationally to them. Rational is not a language of fluency for the vast number of these people. And the more I read the news, the more I'm sure of this. The memo, which was titled Reviewing Funding to State and Local Government Recipients That Are Permitting Anarchy, Violence, and Destruction in American Cities, and was first reported by the New York Post, ratchets up Mr. Trump's argument. But the move is almost certain to face legal challenges, and Democrats and city officials reacted furiously. A spokesman for de Blasio said, as much as Donald Trump wants New York City to drop dead, we will never let this stand. This has nothing to do with law and order. This is a racist campaign stunt out of the Oval Office to attack millions of people of color. An effort by Mr. Trump to curtail funding to so-called sanctuary cities was challenged in court, but a federal appeals court ruled this year that the administration was within its right to withhold some funds, although 3 other appeals courts have ruled that the administration did not have the authority. We actually did some stat digging on this maybe a couple weeks ago, and we determined that currently 25% of all seated federal judges were now appointed by Mitch McConnell and Donald Trump. 25% in 3.5 years. Yeah, that's what they've been doing, just in case you were wondering. The memo appeared to be a dagger aimed squarely at New York, where de Blasio and the state's governor, Andrew Cuomo, both Democrats, have been critical of the federal response to coronavirus. Memo went on at length about the recent rise in crime in New York City and Mr. de Blasio's recent agreement to cut $1 billion in funding to the New York Police Department. To ensure that federal funds are neither unduly wasted nor spent in a manner that directly violates our government's promise to protect life, liberty, and property, it is imperative that the federal government review the use of federal funds by jurisdictions that permit anarchy, violence, and destruction in America's cities. Tremendous cities. Okay, there's like 8 things wrong with this paragraph. First one is Trump is coming down on de Blasio's agreement to cut $1 billion in funding to the New York City Police Department. I checked that. They cut a total of $474 million, which is less than $500 million. But better than that, their entire plan is based on reducing the projection of how much overtime the cops will use because, overtime's predictable. So pretty much they're cutting 3/4 of the piece of that budget by saying, we're pretty sure we'll only spend 300 million on overtime instead of 800 million like we did last year. So let's kill that one out of the gate. Next, ensure that federal funds are neither unduly wasted nor spent in a manner that directly violates our government's promise to protect life, liberty, and property. Whoa. What happened to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness? When did it become life, liberty, and property? Oh, that's right. That's right. We're the United States of capitalism. I totally forgot that somehow we have changed the magical document, which was signed by the mystical founders who owned other human beings, that said life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Because all men are created equal. Whew, are you starting to pick up a theme here, gang? The memo gives Barr 14 days to identify anarchist jurisdictions where officials have, quote, permitted violence and the destruction of property to persist and have refused to undertake reasonable measures, although it does not specify any particular cities. Mr. Voigt has 30 days to direct, quote, heads of agencies on restricting eligibility of or otherwise disfavoring to the maximum extent permitted by law anarchist jurisdictions in the receipt of federal grants, according to the memo. Among the factors Barr is to consider in determining these jurisdictions are whether a jurisdiction forbids the police force from intervening to restore order amid widespread or sustained violence or destruction. Now, this right here is Donald Trump being angry that every time he unleashed an unnamed, unmarked federal police force in American cities and started black bagging people and kidnapping them in vans with no fucking license plates on them. And mayors and governors were like, hey, could you get your goons out of our city? This is Trump's way of saying, if you don't let my goons into your city, we're just going to take federal funding away from you. Oh, but also, we still expect all the people in your state to pay the same amount of federal income tax as people in all the other states. Because liberty and justice for all. Equality. Yeah, that's what we do. The revelation that Mr. Trump was considering such a move came hours after the New York Police Department released data showing that the surging gun violence that has rattled the city this summer and intensified the debate over policing had continued at an alarming rate in August. Shootings more than doubled, and murders rose by nearly 50%. The August numbers reflected a trend that many in U.S. cities are contending with in a year that is already defined by a pandemic and civil unrest, a sharp rise in gun violence, murders, and other crimes that has public officials grasping for explanations and scrambling to respond. Yeah, really, it's not that difficult. When you have like 1/4 of all the people who live in your city or your state staring down the barrel of imminent homelessness because they're going to be evicted because the entire capitalist system has been shattered by a health emergency, and the federal government has been ludicrously slow in providing aid, and when it has, it's been severely limited, and it's not enough to sustain people. Yeah, maybe, just maybe, violence is up and crime is up because the economy is cratered. I feel like there are like 18 or 20 historical precedents that will show this to be a thing. Violent crime always increases in the summer, but the rise has been extreme this year in New York. Since May, the city's recorded almost 800 shootings, an increase of more than 140 compared to last year, and the 180 murders is 50% up from the same time last year. Despite the surging gun violence, police data shows that arrest numbers have declined significantly over the summer, while response times to 911 calls have risen sharply. This has prompted some elected officials to call for an investigation into whether police are staging a work slowdown. So, with 60 days until the election, Donald Trump is going out of his way to make sure that the national conversation is about anything other than his response to coronavirus and what it's done to the economy. These are the only two things that Trump doesn't want people thinking about or talking about for the next 60 days. And that's why he's going to continue putting out reasons to leverage people against each other, because the more conflict that he creates in the White House and in Washington, the more conflict that will trickle down between states and cities and people in cities and across race divides and political divides and ideological divides. And the more conflict there is, the more riot porn there is on TV, the more the cops have to go out and, well, they don't have to go out and gas and shoot people. They're just going to, because that's how they roll. And Trump knows this. And that whole spectacle will keep people away from looking at Corona and looking at our cratered economy. And instead, Trump's going to be pointing at these cities going, look, it's anarchy. The Antifas, they're burning your cities. This is what's going to happen if you elect Joe Biden. Even though it's what's happening while Trump's president. I said this months ago. People laughed at me. They didn't believe me. But I said that Donald Trump is going to find a way to make his reelection the campaign of an insurgent populist, which is something you can't do when you're an incumbent. And yet somehow he's managing to do just that. 60 days left, people. Keep your eye on the prize.